Welcome to Everything Explained. Today on the episode, we've got my good friend John Fields, producer, mixing engineer extraordinaire, and we've got Electro-Voice engineer Ethan Wetzel here, who's going to get into the technical aspects of today's topic, EQ. In its simplest form, an EQ is designed to change the volume of specific frequencies. Now, what I'm going to show you on the screen here is a parametric EQ and a more console-style EQ, vintage-style EQ with knobs. They do the same thing, but they just look different. I like a parametric EQ because it's visual and, I don't know, it's just a little easier for me. Generally speaking, EQ has three different controls. Number one, frequency. What frequency or frequency range do you want to change? Frequencies are measured in hertz, and hertz are associated with pitches. The most common one that we know is A440, a tuning note for most orchestras or musicians. And then the way that the math works out, an octave above that, the next A up is 880, the octave below is 220, so on and so forth. The next parameter is volume. So whatever frequency you choose, you can change the volume of that. Volume is measured in decibels. Ethan, what are decibels?
Boy, that's a great question, Corey. If only there was a video explaining that very term.
Go check it out if you haven't. We've got another video on decibels. And the third thing that we control with an EQ is the shape. Generally speaking, there's three types of shapes that we use in EQs. Basically, that's how I think about it. I think about three different shapes in EQ. Number one is a filter. I have a high-pass filter and a low-pass filter. What a high-pass filter does is it cuts off every frequency below that. So if I set my high-pass frequency to 200 hertz, you're not going to hear anything under 200 hertz. If I set my low-pass filter to 13K, you're not going to hear anything above 13,000 hertz. A shelf. This one is also affecting the extreme ends of the EQ. It's just not as dramatic. You can either add or reduce from the top end or low end, and you can change the shape to make it a little more gradual or a really steep roll-off. The third type of shape is a bell. Now, a bell is one where you can get a little more surgical. So for me, I'm going to choose the frequency, I'm going to change the volume, and then what's going to happen is you're going to have this shape called a Q. Now, the Q is something that I can tighten or loosen to get a little more precise with the changes that I want. So if I feel like a vocal is a little bit muddy in the mid-range, I'm going to take some frequencies out and I'm going to change the Q to see how specific I want to get in that. Now, I said the frequencies are associated with pitches, but just because I'm playing a G note on the guitar doesn't mean that that's the only frequency that you hear. We can dive into that a little bit later, but if I move that frequency up or down, there's actually a lot more information that's going on with sound. And also, another important thing to remember is, for the most part, human hearing goes from 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. As we age, we lose some of that top end, and we need to...
What's that?
We need to adjust our EQ references as time moves on in life, because our ears change and adapt.
Well, and it's not just age. You know, as we discussed in our other conversation, SPL, sound pressure level, also has an impact with how our ears interpret sound. You know, so as I'm listening to something, I can have a baseline of what I'm perceiving, but then I change that SPL, I turn it way, way up, and all of a sudden I'm getting swamped by bass that I wasn't earlier, because that equal loudness curve has shifted. So hearing is a really interesting thing, not only psychoacoustically, but also when we start to think about how sound works.
Psychoacoustically, dude. That's like nice. That. Let's hang on to that one.
Hey, I'm all about the 50-cent words here, right? So I think that was a great introduction, Corey, in talking about the basics of the tools. What I think is also really important to bear in mind is kind of if we zoom out and start thinking about what is sound? What are we actually listening to and what are we perceiving? And when we really get down to what it is that we're working with as we're performing, as we're mixing, as we're engineering, I think it's important to understand kind of the big picture of what makes sound. So fundamentally, we've got a couple of things that we need to pay attention to. The first is going to be spectral content, the frequencies, the highs, the lows, the mids. How do those come out? How do they interact with each other? And most importantly, how do those actually change over time? The other really important thing that we need to bear in mind when we think about sound is amplitude. And we'll talk about that separately, but how does amplitude work? how does spectral content work, and how do those evolve and shift and change over time. That's really what we perceive as timbres or sound. And ultimately, that's what we're trying to engineer and manipulate when we're doing our jobs, right? So to think about how we want to interact with these things, I think it's also really important to sort of dig into what exactly are the tools doing. And your introduction with the different types of EQs, I think, was really, really helpful, because essentially we're taking these bits and pieces and these little slices of our spectral content and manipulating them to achieve a specific end. So one of the things that I want to show everybody here, just to kind of illustrate what we're talking about, are a couple of samples that I've pulled up in RX. So if I look at this first sample, and if I look at the second sample, they look pretty close to each other, right?
Yeah.
What I can do, though, is actually begin to reveal more of the spectral content over and how this evolves over time. And we can see that we're actually talking about two very, very, very different sounds. So our first sample here, just a nice quick attack.
What kind of snare is that, John? What are you thinking?
It's kind of like a dead, maybe Yamaha Paul Lime signature, 1996.
I was thinking 97, but, you know, I mean...
Just kidding. I had no idea what
friendly people can agree to disagree, right? Let's take a listen to something else. Listen to the second sample.
Tell you what, if I'm Stone Cold Steve Austin, I'm worried the second I hear that sound. I know somebody's waking up.
I'm getting hungry.
Wait, did you go Taco Bell on us? I went Undertaker.
Hey,
did you just go Taco Bell?
You know, sometimes the Undertaker has to make a run for the border too. You know, I mean,
Running for the
we're
border,
all people
dude.
here. Absolutely. And yeah, so as we are thinking about sounds and how we're manipulating them, we want to have a deeper understanding of the tools. And one thing that I think is really important in the age of YouTube and the internet, it's so easy to go online and find that one simple trick. Set this parameter of this plugin to these values, and you'll never have to touch anything ever again. You'll be money, it'll be perfect, and everything's going to come rolling in. Bro. Did I use that right? Yeah. Okay. So
wait, use of bro or use of the reference?
Well, you know, we could go either way. I always like the bro stinger.
Yeah.
You know, it gets me there. But one of our fundamental tools is, as you say, EQ in working with this. And we can start out with the fundamentals and the basics that you just described and get increasingly complex and increasingly esoteric, right? So we've got the parametric EQs, which are highly flexible. I can move them around. I can adjust the Q, and I can adjust the gain and the frequency that I'm trying to center on. Another variation of that from, you know, the old school way of doing things was the graphic EQ, which is doing basically the same thing, except my frequencies are fixed and assigned.
Yeah.
So it's just laid out in a different way, but fundamentally we're doing the same thing. And when we're talking about use of filters, I think you had a couple of really good examples for how and where I may use those, but we also find high pass and low pass filters being used in audio components with things like crossovers, where I need to send a different signal to my subwoofer, then a different signal to my low frequency driver, a different signal to my high frequency driver. We achieve that by using different kinds of filters, either digital or analog, to get that split and send the right signal to the right place at the right time, right? But in the world of EQ, it can get even more esoteric when we talk about some additional types of technology and additional shapes. A really good example, and we're going to go deep into the nerd well here, are going to be IIR, or infinite impulse response filters, versus FIR, or finite impulse response filters. So an IIR filter is really designed to emulate the analog world. You know, we have similar shapes, we have similar sounds, we have the same kind of frequency and phase relationship that you'll use with analog filters. Whereas an FIR filter is a very specialized, very complex digital filter that allows us to create virtually any shape that we want. And this is one of the things in loudspeaker engineering that we'll use inside of our systems to achieve linear frequency and linear phase response inside of a system, because we can manipulate those two parameters separately. So we have a lot of flexibility with how we can work with filters and EQ shapes, but these days we're seeing even more interesting and novel technologies come out with things like I'm showing with RX here, or some of the new spectral processing plugins that are coming out, like Soothe, for example. That's making more granular and detailed adjustments to the spectral content, and we're able to get increasingly more precise. So when we're talking about these different kinds of EQs, one of the things that I want to make sure everybody understands is a tool is only as good as your use for it, right? Just because somebody says you should throw something on a signal doesn't necessarily make it so. You've got to understand what you're listening to and what you're actually trying to achieve. So a couple of places or things to bear in mind when we're thinking about using EQ or spectral processing is, what am I actually trying to achieve? Am I trying to use it as a technical correction? For example, on a interview mic or something like this, I can use a high-pass filter to chop out all of the low-end rumble, so I'm not picking that up inside of my recording.
All the construction that's going on outside right
Absolutely,
now.
yeah. And to that end, we've got some noise going on in the background. We can use spectral processing to find those very discrete things and get them out or turn them up or down. So there's the technical correction and technical fixing versus sweetening and enhancement, adding things like warmth or air. Am I trying to move things into a different space artistically or creatively? And sometimes we're trying to do both. When we're doing a mix, for example, and we're trying to deal with frequency masking, I could have two instruments that are sitting right on top of each other. I've got to kind of do some technical correction, but I also want to make sure that I'm staying true to the instrument and to the creative element of that sound, right?
Yeah. We've been discussing the wand. Let's consult the wizard.
There we go. Absolutely.
John, a lot of technical talk here. You've taught me a lot about EQ, why to use EQ, where to use it. Why should you cut? Why should you boost? What things do you need to negotiate while you're doing a mix, while you're producing something, while you're trying to create a tone as a producer? Give us some things. Can you tell us what you're thinking about or what you're listening for?
So there's a couple things you got to think about when you're dealing with EQ. You got the sound itself. Like, let's say you're focusing in on one sound, the electric guitar in Cory Wong case here, the Strat. It's a DI. It sounds like this, but that's just one element of the mix. Obviously, there's drums, there's bass, there's horns, and you want it to fit a certain way. So, the first things first is there a problem with the initial sound? Is there a rumble on the bottom?
Yeah.
Is there like some whistle at the top? Or, so we could filter those down with low pass, high pass. But also, you want it to sound like the natural quality sound that comes out of your fingers, which is basically the sound of that instrument. But then in the context of the mix, it could be completely different. Like, it sounds amazing alone.
Yeah.
You got it great. And then you put it in there with the horns and the other keyboards, and now there's a fight. The organ or the piano happens to be kind of in the same range. So sometimes, you have to start making decisions on, do I want to cut this out of the guitar, or do I want to cut this out of the piano to make room for it? You can also, the EQ is a great way to do that. You can pan also and move things to the sides.
Yeah.
But we don't need to get into that.
No, but I think that's a really great point, because what we're ultimately trying to do is make the sounds work together in the mix. We want to create this cohesive thing. And we have a ton of tools to be able to do that. Sometimes EQ is the answer, but not always.
No.
I mean, there are other things that we can work with. Panning, dynamics, level control, all of those different things can work independently or with each other to get that mix. So I think that's a great comment.
That's just how I think about EQ, though, is and then the cut before boost thing. I mean, usually, you learn this when you're coming up, like roll off everything on every track. Well, I don't really do that. I've never done that. I don't really understand it. I don't work with the subwoofer in my mixing studio. They're uncomfortable for me. Like, they're adding too much that I don't want to hear. but I'm sure there's stuff going on there. And so, I just use common sense when cutting off lows on a Strat or something. I know there's nothing that's going to be under 60 that matters, or maybe even 100, depends. But the next thing is the boost. It's like, where do you want it to poke? I mean, a lot of the times when we're mixing like Cory music, that guitar needs to poke a little bit more than maybe on a normal mix or something, because there's a guitar solo or there's a pair of Strats that you want to really poke out. So you just find that little spot and you're like tweaking around till you get to that 2, 3, 4K, and then just a little bump up on that. And next thing you know, you didn't have to turn it up for volume. I mean, it is volume. It is turning it up essentially by adding some EQ. But what you think you might say to me, hey, I wish the guitar was louder. And sometimes the answer to that is not turn it up, but just boost like a 2.5K little bump. And sometimes that'll solve that problem. A lot of the times, same thing with like percussion elements, tambourines, shakers, cymbals. It's like the cymbals are too loud. Well, maybe they're not too loud. Maybe they're just too bright. And you just need to like roll off some top, gently slope off some of the 8K and above, and that might solve the problem in the same way that volume could.
Okay, well, so can we talk about a couple problems that people commonly face in mixes and how you use EQ to solve those? Number one, the relationship between the kick drum and the bass guitar. Just some simple basic things that you listen for and look for, and why you might make different decisions on different tunes.
I mean, so subjective, because every kick drum, that's funny. On one hand, every kick drum sounds the same.
Yeah.
On the other, they all sound different to me. But 9 times out of 10, you take an EV microphone, stick it in a kick drum. I don't care if it's what brand of kick drum, what head you're using. 90% of them sound pretty similar.
Yeah.
This thing that happens. And, we're not going to get into like triggering samples at this point. We're talking about like, actual sonic capture. Until you start literally rolling off lots of top end. I mean, if you listen to music from the 60s, there was no high end on kick drums ever. Like, it just wasn't a thing. They didn't even have the mic in the kick drum. It was like, they just didn't do that till probably early 70s. So, but now it's so, people have become accustomed to like the punch, and everyone wants to hear everything. Let's just say all the band members and they want to hear more me all the time. So you want to, and that kind of contributed to the modern mixing philosophy, which is kind of everything being the loudest thing in the mix. So it's like, how do you get a high quality, to be able to hear like every bass note, every kick drum, even the little half level ones, doops, the little 16th notes. It's you're wrestling with that constantly, and that honestly compression kind of plays into that as well. But on the EQ, side, just for me, it's just making each instrument, the clearest it can be, and then taking into consideration the creative side, which is, sometimes clear is not what we want.
Right.
So, everything's subjective on the mixing thing. So the kick and bass thing, they're definitely down in the same area, that 60, 100, 40, all some up to 220 sometimes. And so you're just wrestling, like, where do you want this to sit, and then what else is in the mix? And
well, and I think that's a great point. And this is why I personally feel it's so important to understand what you're trying to achieve and what the elements of the music are, particularly when we're talking about spectral content. And this sample I've got pulled up actually has a really interesting example of what we're seeing here. So this is a harmonic ladder that's showing up from this tone. Now, our fundamental, of course, is the very, very strong, boomy low end. I'll play it again just so everybody can hear this. But all of these other harmonic ladders are adding elements to that presence. So when we're talking about a kick drum and it just isn't cutting through in the mix, maybe it's not the fundamental that I'm adjusting or moving out of the way. Maybe I'm trying to go a little bit higher order in that harmonic ladder to add that attack, or maybe pulling something back so it's not stepping on that really important part of the spectrum. It's not always the obvious thing that's going to correct that.
Right.
So understanding the spectra and the tools and where exactly I want to make room for different things, I think is really the key to success.
I think in Cory's music, a lot of the times you, like on kick drum, you don't love a clicky kick. And, a lot of other, working with a different band the same week and they want the clicky kick.
Yeah.
So with him, I've kind of learned that's just like out of the equation, which is that 2.5, 4K bump that a lot of people like to add. Like a lot of these kick mics, not this one, but the ones that are made for bass drums,
right,
sometimes have these little boosts built into them, and because it became such a thing in the 80s and 90s to like just start, like, why add when we could just have it there already? So
right.
Okay, a couple other things. Harshness in cymbals. A lot of times, you brought that up. It's like, cymbals are too harsh, but like I want them to be bright. How do you solve that? Do you just find, because sometimes it's like, I don't know, one cymbal just seems to.
I mean, I would start with the drummer, actually.
But
a lot of the times you don't have control of that because you're mixing something and it's already been recorded, or it's a live performance or whatever.
Yeah.
And a lot of people live, I call them bashers.
Yeah.
Just like, I just wish. And I think something that studio drummers learn, and why live drummers become sought after studio drummers, is for something like that, control over the entire kit and the level of cymbal smashage. But how do you soothe something? I mean, good. You said the word soothe. That plugin is an interesting
Honestly, that
thing.
plugin is so dope.
But before that came out 5 years ago, or you're just literally looking for that 7K place where it's like every time that drummer hits that cymbal real hard, you're gonna cut that 7K. So back in the day, I would automate sometimes. Every time, like the top of a chorus, every time there's a downbeat crash, I would literally have either volume or EQ dip just there, and then it comes back to normal after that crash has been hit. It's hard to do.
Yeah.
So again, it's back to the skill level of the drummer in the first place about not bashing.
Yeah.
But that's hard to control excitement.
Yeah.
A lot of times. So.
Right. Well, and I mean, there's other tools that we can use, things like dynamic EQ. Maybe that can become an answer. Where it can also get really squirrely is if you've got something that changes pitches. I remember I was working on a track that had a really, really high resonant analog synth, and it sounded amazing, except when the person really leaned into it, you had this massive spike. The problem was, as they played up and down the scale, that spike would move too. So, there are things like tracking EQs that you can use that can zero in on some of those and move along with the pitch. There's other more broad-based tools that you can use. It's really all about understanding, again, what am I hearing and what's the right tool and approach to try to get in and correct that.
Yeah. 2 quick last questions. Number 1, why would you use a parametric EQ versus a console style with knobs? Just like, what do you, not even, just.
I'm kind of confused
why,
when you say that, honestly, because they're the same to me.
Yeah.
So
okay.
I don't know what
different
you mean.
flavors. Yeah.
I'm just saying, like, you're at a Neve and you got the EQ.
Okay, well, you mean
like
when you say, are you talking about like graphically where you can like see the?
Yeah, like a Fab Filter Pro Q3 versus when you pull up the SSL EQ.
So why would I use? A lot of the newer tools have like a spectral graph as as you solo up the snare drum and you're looking at it. You can actually see the graphic representation of where that snare drum is taking place. And that's why you would want to use something with a graphical kind of interface where you can actually like go in there, find the problem, and duck it. Why would I use a Neve with no graphic? Well, because I'm used to using Neves from a long time ago, and I understand that there's a magic to I think it's the 12K knob, the just bumping that up a dB on a vocal by and it just all of a sudden it opens it up in a certain way that I'm used to, but I don't really see necessarily any positive the reason that's better.
Okay,
they're both to me they're kind of the same.
They're the same.
you know.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just another thing to think about is, again, what am I actually trying to do? You know, and if I'm trying to do a mix and work with a track, whether it's live or in the studio, you know, things like Pultecs with the old analog stuff were designed and specified in a really specific way to hit sweet spots, and something that you can dial in really quickly and really easily. But if I've got a track that I've got hiss, or I've got this really narrow thing that I'm trying to either enhance or remove, I just can't get that surgical or precise with something like an analog EQ. So maybe that's when I go to something that's going to be parametric.
Sure.
Like I say, with things like the Fab filter or Surf EQ, those offer other tools for things like pitch tracking or dynamic adjustment, which sometimes you need, but sometimes you don't. You know, and ultimately, I think the best thing that a producer or a live engineer can do is learn a tool really, really well. You know, if you have 100 plugins in your folder and you're constantly switching back and forth between them, you may be getting good results, but you're not really maximizing your skill and what you have. So understand what you're trying to do, understand your tools, and really try to focus in on things. And, you know, I personally am a less is more kind of person. So, you know, get the clean sample, get the clean take, use the right mic, do whatever you can to get a good source, and that's just going to work itself out in the mix.
I agree.
Thanks for hanging with us. We got a whole series, Everything Explained with EV. Plenty more videos, all kinds of topics. Get in there. Peace.